All right. Well, once again, welcome. I am Matthew. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm glad to be back. Our family was blessed. We did a couple of week vacation down in Florida. There is a ministry there that is meant to bless pastors and missionaries. And so we were down there, and every time we go, I'm faced with this dilemma of, am I going to drive straight through, or are we going to stop and spend way too much money on a really janky hotel? So we did that on the way down, and it was indeed kind of a nasty, cheap hotel. Well, not cheap, it's still expensive. But so on the way back, we decided we're going to drive through. And one of the things I do to make it through, well, there's a few things. One thing I've learned is that if you get a box of Milk Duds, it's really hard to fall asleep at the wheel when you're chewing vigorously on a box of Milk Duds. Pairs nicely with a gas station coffee, I've learned. And then I put in, I don't know if this is legal, sorry, police officers in the room. I put in my AirPods and I listen to music. And there's a certain type of music I listen to because I don't actually, in like all of my life, I don't listen to much Christian music. Please don't stone me. I don't. My go-to for like extended devotional times or times with God is not music. I love that folks do that. I respect that. I'm married to someone who connects really well in that way. I have tons of friends. That's just not ever really been natural for me. But what I do love, and what I've loved since actually before I was a Christian, is listening for the longing for God in the words of angsty, restless, and probably not Christian musicians. Anyone else do that? Okay. Maybe I'm just delayed emo phase from high school. Came out a little later. In fact, true story, it was the lyrics of a song by the band Counting Crows, not the Casting Crowns, y'all. The Counting Crows, that great 90s alternative rock band that echoed in my ears literally the night that I surrendered my life to Jesus back in 2001. And for some reason, I locate my longing for God more easily in the words of those that I can tell are still wrestling, that are still striving and searching. And it reminds me of when I was there and how God met me and delivered me, brought me to saving faith. And one of my favorite musicians today, who I doubt hardly any of you have ever heard of, is a guy named Josh Ritter. Anybody? That's exactly what I thought. Okay, one, yay, okay. So I love seeing, he was named like one of the top living songwriters by a magazine I've never read, so I don't know if it's legit. I think he's pretty good, but I love seeing his spiritual wrestling in his music, his striving to make sense of the world, and I appreciate the moments when in his songs he questions and even critiques his own agnosticism, and he sees the limitations and the shortcomings of that belief system. It's as if he wants to believe, but he's just not there yet, which is why I wish he and I were friends. If you know him, let me know. And there's a few lines in this really long, absurdly like 8-minute long song called Thin Blue Flame, which is kind of a song about heaven that has stuck with me for years and years and years. And here are the lines of the song, a little snippet of the song. He says, if God's up there, he's in a cold, dark room. The heavenly hosts are just the cold, dark moons. He bent down and made the world in 7 days, and ever since, he's been walking away. And there's something about the honesty in that line that speaks to and even breaks my heart. I hear in his words traces of sometimes the doubt that creeps into my own life. I look around and I see all sorts of brokenness, all sorts of evil in this world, and I think about how the number of unanswered prayers in my life and in the prayers of the people that I know who are seeking God just keep piling up year after year after year. And I can relate, even if it's in a different way, even if it's coming from now a place of faith, to the doubt and the frustration of those lines. And I think if we're honest, there are times in our lives where we just simply cannot make sense of what God is doing. We just look around and there's no ground. We don't know what is happening. Stuff happens, or maybe it doesn't happen, right? And we ask God, what is going on? Why is this happening? And in that space, in those moments, I think it's really natural for us to assume that God has abandoned us. When we don't know what's happening, our instinct, it's like our default goes to, God has somehow left us. Now, I've never met Josh Ritter, probably never will, but I wonder if that's what's behind this line of his song. God, where are you and what are you up to is a prayer that I pray sometimes. I suspect it's one, if we're honest, that we have prayed, and maybe some of us have prayed really recently. And I suspect Joseph, the man at the center of our passage today, prayed something like it often, and probably for many years of his life. When it seemed like the promises of God, of our God, were never going to be fulfilled, and when the evil of his brothers completely upended his life. So we're wrapping up this series in Genesis. We spent about 2 months going through a book that's 50 chapters long, and we're coming to the end of it today, and we are going to cover a lot of ground. The story of Joseph starts in Genesis chapter 37 and follows all the way through to the end of the book in chapter 50. And if you were with us last week, you heard the tragic beginning of the story, right? Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob, was despised by his brothers for these dreams that he kept having. These dreams where he was somehow their ruler. He was somehow in this position of authority over his brothers, and they were bowing down to worship him, to receive from him. And that does not just generally fly, right? Like a little brother saying he's going to be Lord over you, like that just in general doesn't work. But even more so, like much, much more so in a culture that prizes the firstborn son. Definitely not the 11th born son. So whether it was because they actually were afraid it would happen, that he would somehow become their master, or simply because they hated him, we don't really know. They decided to make a plan. His brothers initially intended to murder him, but then mercifully they changed their mind. They strip him of his special ornate robe and they throw him into a pit. Again, just recapping from last week, a group of Midianites passed by. They took him and they sold him as a slave to the Egyptians. And where we ended last week, it ends with the story of these brothers making up this story, fabricating this story, complete with his robe, stained in goat's blood. They killed a blood. They put a little blood. They killed a goat, put the blood on it. Went to the dad, said, "Hey, Dad, Joseph was mauled, just torn to pieces by this wild beast. He's dead." And chapter 37 ends with this just awful moment of Jacob tearing his clothes and weeping over what he believed was his dead son, who wasn't actually dead. The bulk of the story of Joseph covers some 20 years of his life in about 13 chapters, and it's a story chock full of drama. It has all the markings of a box office success. I haven't watched one of those in a while because I have 4 kids, but this is what I think is in them. Conflict, intrigue, temptation, betrayal, deceit, concealed identities, all giving way to forgiveness, love, redemption, and hope. Sounds like what would make up an amazing movie. But what strikes me most and what I want us to see is the humanity of the story. 7 times throughout these 13 chapters, we read of Joseph weeping. And he's always weeping at the most critical moments in the story. And because we don't have time, and you'll be happy to hear this, to go through all 13 chapters this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to sort of tell the story via these highlights of Joseph weeping. That's going to be sort of our guide through a really long narrative here, is we're going to key into the moments that we see Joseph weeping. And as we make our way through his life, through the story of his life, my hope is that we would enter into, we'd really see and try to place ourselves in that position of his suffering, his sorrow, his confusion, so that we might also encounter his faith, his genuine trust in God, and that we'd ask the question all along the way, right? God, what could you possibly be up to in all of this? Before we get to the scenes of him weeping, we have to sort of catch ourselves up in the story. So let's go through this in fast forward, okay? 3x, 4x speed. Joseph is in Egypt. He's living as a slave in the home of an Egyptian official named Potiphar, and we're told that he is well received by Potiphar from the very start. So much so that in chapter 39, we read Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Massive responsibility handed to this slave, to this foreigner. And that sounds great. That sounds terrific. But then almost immediately, something bad happens. He gets seduced by Potiphar's wife. And though he doesn't give in to her persuasion, she lies and he gets tossed into jail. But then the same kind of thing happens. He's in jail for a little while, but then he's given favor in the eyes of the warden. He gets put in charge of everyone and everything in the prison. Then some Egyptians, including Pharaoh himself start having some unsettling dreams, and they learn that this young man, has a special ability to interpret dreams. And so he does it ultimately for Pharaoh, and it paints a grave picture. Joseph tells him that his dreams are a foreshadowing of this severe famine that will go all through the land and ultimately all through the world, and that it will come in 7 years' time. So he gives him like a 7-year lead time, and he tells him it's going to last 7 years. And so Pharaoh is astonished by and so thankful, right, that he has been given this warning that something awful is going to happen in his land, that he says in chapter 41, listen to this, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. That's a big promotion. Pretty big promotion, right? Big task. That then puts Joseph in charge of this monumental task of storing up food for Egypt so that when the famine comes, the nation will survive. And here's a really important detail that we cannot miss. At the end of chapter 41, we're told all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. So everyone is struggling to stay alive. Okay, so we've covered 5 chapters so far. We only have 8 more to go. But I want to pause for some perspective. Joseph, scholars believe, was about 17 years old when he was sold into slavery. He is now about 37 years old. So 20 years have passed. 2 entire decades. He has not seen his dad. His mom is already dead. He has not seen his dad. He has not seen any of his siblings. He is living far from home in a foreign land. And while he's been promoted to these influential positions, he is still the property of Egypt. He belongs to them. And maybe you can intuit where this story is going. The famine ultimately reaches Joseph's family. It reaches his dad and his brothers. And so they make the long journey to Egypt to buy grain, to grow crops from Joseph himself. We all understand what's going on here? It's building. The story is building. Genesis 42, verse 6 reads, Now Joseph was governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, look what happens. They bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. This is it. This is the dream. This is the dream that he had when he was a little boy that he shared that so angered his brothers that they wanted to kill him. It happened. It is happening right here. They're bowing down to him. That vision is coming true. And when Joseph sees his brothers bowed down, he weeps for the first time, the first of what will be 7 times. And see, they don't recognize him. He's probably clean shaven. He's all grown up. He's speaking Egyptian, so they don't know who he is. But of course, he knows who they are. And at this point, he chooses not to reveal himself. And I try to imagine the emotion happening inside of his chest as he lays eyes after 20 years on the guys that his brothers who wanted him dead. And still he knew from his dream that it was all of his brothers who were bowing to worship him. His youngest brother, Benjamin, the other son of Rachel, did not make the journey to Egypt. So Joseph fills their sacks with grain so that they can grow crops and survive, and he tells them, come back. But when you come back, you have to bring Benjamin with you. And so they leave, and probably months go by, and they return for more grain, and this time they do bring Benjamin along. And when Joseph lays eyes on his younger brother, he weeps for the second time. Genesis 43:30 records the moment. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out, and he looked for a place to weep. He didn't want to do it in front of them. And so he went to a private room, and he wept there. So we're blazing through the story. We're going to jump ahead to chapter 45. Joseph is about to reveal himself for who he really is, because they still don't know, right? And I want us to really capture the irony and the power of this moment. His life has been completely thrown off the rails, completely upended, off course by the sin and the evil of his brothers. And yet now, he finds himself in the position where he can save the lives of the ones who so coldly and cruelly wanted to end his. Right? He orders everyone else out of the room except his brothers. And before he says a word, he weeps a third time. And this time, he weeps so loudly that the whole household of Pharaoh could hear it, Genesis tells us. Then the moment arrives, right, the climax of the whole story, 45 verse 3. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified, of course, at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold in Egypt. Now pay close attention to what happens next. This is absolutely astonishing. And now, do not be distressed. This is what he is saying to his brothers. Don't be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. What? Like 20 years is plenty of time for bitterness to settle deep down inside a human heart and to steal our compassion. It's plenty of time to devise an elaborate plan for how you're going to get your revenge, right? How you're going to pay back the evil done to you. And yet what comes out of his mouth is concern for them. Don't be worried. Don't be troubled. And then this profound trust in God. How is that even possible? How does a person live with that kind of peace? We're going to answer that a little bit later. Let's keep going in the story. Joseph tells them to journey back. Now it's time to go get the dad. We got to go get Jacob because he's going to provide a land for them near Egypt, in Goshen, in the land of Egypt, and they're going to be well fed. He will take care of them. He will make sure they have everything they need if they just get a little bit closer to him. And right before they leave, again, this is now for the second time, they're going to leave, go back, get the dad, come back. We read of the fourth and definitely the most poignant moment in Joseph's weeping. In Hebrew, 7's a big word, and there's these things called chiasms, and so the fourth one is the one in the very middle. This is the fourth time he's weeping, and so the author is really wanting us to see that this is it. This is the central moment in the story. Verse 14, then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin, and he wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Again, I try to imagine the intensity of the redemption of this moment. The brothers leave. They tell their dad the news. Of course, he's elated. They make the journey back with him. He makes the journey back with them this time. And in 46:29, we read, Joseph had his chariot made ready, and he went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father, and he wept for a long time. Fifth time he weeps. Joseph gives his dad and his brothers the land that he promised them, and they survive the famine. Chapter 47 tells us they were fruitful and they increased in number. So in the midst of a severe famine, the Israelites did not just survive, they actually flourished. So skipping over now real fast, huge chunks of the story, it draws to a close with Jacob's death. The sixth and the seventh time that Joseph weeps surround the death of his father. And after he dies, right, his brothers are assuming like this is all just a front. He's just doing this because dad is here and he doesn't want to dishonor us in front of dad. So the moment the dad dies, they think this is all going to change. They doubt his character. Think it was fake. And so they're scared. And in chapter 50, they bow down before him again. It's like the dream all over again. They bow down and they declare, we are now your slaves. Just don't hurt us. Don't do the thing that we know you're going to do. But yet Joseph replies with the most gracious words. In chapter 50, verse 19, Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. End of story. A long one, an incredible one. Spans this massive section of the book of Genesis, almost 1/3 of the book. And if you're like me, when you read Old Testament narrative, you ask the question at the end, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, what? This is cool. Great story. What am I supposed to do? And does this in any way speak to my life now, here, today? It's obviously a very detailed and specific account of one man's life, but behind all the twists and the turns, right, the plot twists, there's this character development going on, and there's these massive themes that are being revealed. It's not just the story of Joseph. It's not just the story of Joseph. It is like every other story in Scripture, ultimately a story about God at work amongst his people. So I want to end by answering just two simple questions that I think we always have to answer when we read the Bible, which is this: what is this story really about, and how do I live in light of it? So we're going to work quickly through these. What's the story about? I think it's a story about God's providence, provision, and power to fulfill his promises. And I want to take those one at a time. It's a story of God's providence. If we go all the way back to the very beginning of Genesis, right, where we started this series, we find the story of God creating us, right, and placing us in the garden and giving us this task of ruling and reigning over creation and bearing his image. We rebelled, right? And the curse of sin is now over us. We're kicked out of Eden, but God moves toward us, right? He makes a way, and then he would make a promise to this man, Abraham. He would tell him that he would bless his family and that his family would be a blessing for all the world. And that one day, we learn that a Savior would come from Abraham's line and break the curse forever. If the line of Abraham, if these 12 sons of Jacob die, whether by famine or by killing each other in a war, then the promise can't be fulfilled, meaning that either God lied or that he just got it wrong. And neither of those are an option, right? What we see in this story is God's hidden but steady hand accomplishing his purposes. One commentator said this: through all the ups and the downs, the betrayal, injustice, power, deceit, reconciliation, God was at work at a higher level. Calvin called this Joseph story, quote, a most beautiful example of divine providence. Against all odds, despite setback after setback, God puts Joseph in the perfect position to save the lives of his brothers and to carry forward the promise of a nation that bears witness to God. And here's the really crazy thing, y'all. This is like nuts. He doesn't just do it in spite of the sinful actions of his brothers. God does it through them. Now, there's a whole teaching in that we're not going to do today. But just know this, it's because of the sin of the brothers that Joseph is able to keep his family alive. To me, that's equal parts strange, unsettling, and wildly encouraging. What does it mean for us? Here's what I think it means. There's no situation, there's no circumstance in your life through which God cannot work. There is no scheme of evil that can undo his purposes for your life. You may be sitting here today thinking, I'm not where I want to be. There have been surprises. There have been setbacks and sorrows, sins that I've done or sins that have been done to me. And the temptation when we sit there is to think, I need to somehow get past them. I need to move beyond them. I need to put that behind me so that then I can get into God's will. So that then I can walk with God and be in alignment with him. And for some of us who are really tired or just really hurt, we don't see God redeeming any of it at all, ever. Whatever dreams he had for us, whatever dreams we had, are long gone now. And please know that I do not say this lightly. And what I'm about to say does not mean that all of our questions get answered. And it absolutely does not mean that the sting of the pain or the trauma will go away. There are as many questions that come out of this story as there are answers. But what we do know is that somehow through all of it, God accomplished his purposes. He worked through all that didn't make sense and all that hurt to get his people where he wanted them to be. And I think he will do the same for us. I think that's what the story of Joseph is about. How can we be sure of that? Because of the second theme. This is a story of God's provision. Obviously, we could talk about big picture, how he provides for Israel, the nation, how he kept them from dying in the famine. But I just want to kind of zoom in on Joseph. He provided a way out of that initial plan, right, to murder him. He had him be purchased by an influential guy who he would gain favor with. God gave him that favor. Then God gave him favor with the prison war. And then God gave him the ability to interpret dreams. Then God sent Pharaoh with him with a dream. And then God gave him the ability to interpret that dream. He gave him influence with Pharaoh, so much so that he had authority over all of Egypt. And God placed him in the exact position, the only possible position to save his family. But the thing that struck me as I read this story over and over again was actually something a little different. This line pops up a couple of times throughout the story, and it says, and the Lord was with Joseph. I just wonder, what if more than all the circumstances that God orchestrated, it was his presence that most sustained and fueled Joseph's faith? And what if that same thing is true for us today? What if it's his presence that we need more than anything? When life isn't making sense, when our circumstances make us think that he has walked away, when harmful, maybe even heinous, evil things have been done into and around us, we know that God runs to those who are desperate for his presence. Earlier, we asked, how in the world was Joseph able to be so gracious to his brothers, so convinced of God's sovereign plan in the midst of the upheaval of his own life? My suspicion is that it's because he lived his life in the presence of God. He received from God. He was comforted by God. He was instructed. He had deep truths revealed to him. He was guarded and protected from despair by God. And I wonder if for us, we just get so fixated on, God, will you change the circumstances? God, will you work this out? Will you orchestrate this thing? Will you do that? Not that those are bad prayers to pray, but I wonder if somehow, we get, just answer all my why questions. And those are fair questions. Don't hear me saying they're not. But we get so fixated, God, just give me all the answers to the why, that we've forgotten the healing power of his presence, of just being with him. That might heal our wounds, that might give us vision and fresh understanding. So it's a story of God's providence and his provision. It's also a story of God's power, and this is where we end. His power to turn what is evil into good. This is what God always does. Yes, God is powerful in that he can speak everything into existence, and we see unimaginable power, right, in creation. But there's this thing that God loves to do all through the scriptures where he takes the unlikely, the impossible, there's no way you can do anything with that kind of thing, and he uses that very thing to do what he wants to do, right? It's what happened in the Joseph story. A son of Abraham left for dead and sold into slavery in pagan Egypt, delivered into the hands of an extremely powerful Pharaoh who ruled a powerful nation. Nothing good can come of this. Nothing good could possibly come out of this. And yet it's the salvation of the people of Israel that God accomplishes in it. It's the nature of his power. It surprises us. It comes humbly. It's almost hidden. And Joseph got it so much so that he could say these words to his brothers: "You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good." A few thousand years after Joseph, a group of people would be gathered around another influential man of an influential and powerful nation. And they would yell, "Crucify him, crucify him." And that man would eventually give in to what the people wanted. Soldiers would strip and beat and spit upon the God who came to us as a man. They'd drive nails through his wrists and his feet. They'd hoist him up on a cross to die a viciously slow death. As the mockers would whisper, if he were really God, he would get himself off. The God who came to rescue his people being murdered by the ones that his own hands made. The worst evil. The evil of all evils. Unthinkably foolish, right? Unthinkably foolish. A complete waste. And the result, everyone thought, was hopelessness. But the power of God to transform what is evil into good climaxed on the cross of Jesus Christ. In the crucifixion of Jesus, the absolute worst evil became the absolute best good. Unrivaled harm became unrivaled hope. Because on the third day, he would rise victorious over that evil that led him to the cross. His humiliation on the cross became his exaltation as the king over all the world. And so how do we live in light of all of this today? We hold on to hope. We hold on to hope. In our despair, in our depression, in our confusion, when we don't yet have an answer for all the whys of our life, we just dare to trust. God has not walked away. Josh Ritter gets it wrong. God has not walked away. He is with us. He is fulfilling his promises. He is accomplishing his purposes in our life. And when the only path we can possibly walk is by faith and not by sight, he will give us strength and hope from his storehouses. He will give us himself. Would you bow your heads and pray with me?